The summer Clara Bell turned 12, she began collecting flower pots that nobody wanted. She rode an old blue bicycle along the narrow roads of Mon County, Tennessee, pulling a wooden cart her father had built from 2 wagon wheels and a piece of weathered flooring. She stopped at farmhouses, greenhouses, abandoned sheds, and porches where cracked pots had been left beneath benches for years. She did not want the painted ones. She did not want plastic containers or glazed ceramic planters decorated with flowers. She asked only for plain clay pots, the rough reddish kind that darkened when they were wet. Most people gave them to her without asking many questions. "Take the whole pile," one woman told her. "They have been sitting behind the smokehouse since before you were born." Others watched Clara load the pots into her cart and tried to guess what she was doing. Some thought she planned to sell seedlings at the county market. Some believed she was making decorations for her mother's garden. A few assumed it was simply one of those summer projects children began with great seriousness and abandoned as soon as the weather became hot. Clara corrected none of them. She carried every pot to the eastern edge of her family's tomato field, where her father had allowed her to use 6 narrow rows. Then she began digging. The first hole was deep enough to swallow the pot almost completely. Clara placed the vessel between 2 tomato plants, packed the soil around it, and left only the rim visible above the ground. She filled it with water and covered the opening with a flat piece of limestone. Then she moved several feet down the row and dug another hole. By the end of the first morning, her palms were blistered. By the end of the second, the knees of her work trousers had turned the color of red Tennessee soil. By the end of the week, more than 24 clay rims formed a strange line between the tomato plants. If quiet stories about farming, patience, and people who notice what others overlook mean something to you, subscribe and join us. There is always another lesson waiting in an ordinary field. Clara's father, Thomas Bell, stood near the equipment shed one evening and watched his daughter lower another pot into the ground. Thomas had grown tomatoes for more than 20 years. He understood irrigation lines, pumps, fertilizer schedules, insects, market prices, and the 1,000 small decisions that separated a good harvest from a poor one. He did not understand why his daughter was burying flower pots. "You know plants grow above the ground," he finally said. Clara looked up from the hole. "I know." "Then why are you hiding the pots?" "I am not hiding them." "What are you doing?" Clara pressed soil around the vessel with both hands. "I want to see whether the water stays longer." Thomas waited for more, but Clara returned to her work. He did not laugh. That was not his way. But later, at the farm supply store, 2 neighboring growers asked him whether his daughter had started planting pottery. Thomas smiled because he did not yet have a better answer. By the middle of June, people along the road had started calling them Clara's buried cups. The name reached the feed store, the Sunday church steps, and eventually the vegetable market in Lafayette. Nobody meant anything cruel by it. The idea simply looked too strange to be serious. A field was supposed to contain plants, stakes, hoses, and irrigation pipe. It was not supposed to contain dishes. What nobody understood was that Clara had not begun with the pots. She had begun with the way water disappeared. The Bell farm covered a little more than 40 acres of rolling ground that had belonged to the family for 3 generations. The lower land held corn and hay. The warmer eastern slope, where the morning sun reached first, was planted with tomatoes, peppers, and several rows of summer squash. Thomas Bell sold most of his produce through a regional packing house. His wife, Margaret, kept the accounts, organized the market deliveries, and seemed able to remember the price of every seed packet purchased during the previous 10 years. Clara's older brother, Nathan, preferred machinery. Her younger sister, Elsie, preferred animals and followed the farm cats through the barn as though they were leading her somewhere important. Clara preferred soil. She noticed when the ground beneath a fence post stayed damp longer than the ground around it. She noticed that water poured beside a young plant often ran along the surface instead of sinking straight down. She noticed that after a hot afternoon, the top inch of soil could look dark in the morning and turn pale and powdery before supper. Most adults saw a dry field and thought it needed more water. Clara wondered where the water already used had gone. The answer began in her grandmother Evelyn's herb garden during the spring before Clara started collecting pots. They had been moving rosemary and sage from one side of the garden to the other, when Clara's shovel struck something hollow beneath the soil. Together they uncovered an old clay vessel with a broken rim. It had been buried beside a patch of thyme so long that neither of them remembered putting it there. The surface soil was dry from several rainless days, but the earth touching the pot was cool and dark. Clara pressed her fingers against it. "Why is it wet here?" Evelyn turned the vessel in her hands. It was plain and glazed clay, rough enough to scratch the skin. "Because this kind of clay breathes," she said. Clara frowned. "Pots do not breathe." "Not the way we do. But water can move through them." Slowly. That evening, Evelyn opened an old wooden cabinet in the back room of her house. Inside were gardening books, seed catalogues, and agricultural pamphlets collected by Clara's grandfather before his death. One thin booklet described a form of underground irrigation that had been used in dry regions long before electric pumps, rubber hoses, or metal sprinklers existed. The principle was almost embarrassingly simple. A porous clay vessel was buried near the roots of a plant. Water was poured inside and the opening was covered. Instead of flooding the surface, the moisture moved slowly through the vessel's walls into the surrounding earth. When the soil was already wet, the movement slowed. When the soil became dry, it drew more water outward. The ground took only what it could hold. Clara read the booklet twice. Then she brought it home and placed it beside her bed. The Bell family watered their tomato rows from a well near the equipment shed. A pump pushed the water through long hoses, and workers moved the lines between sections of the field. The system worked, but much of the water landed on exposed ground. Some evaporated. Some flowed downhill between the rows. Some encouraged weeds that grew far from the tomato roots. Clara began testing old pots behind the barn. She filled each one and marked the water level with a piece of charcoal. A glazed blue pot held nearly all its water through the afternoon. A badly cracked vessel emptied before lunch. A plain clay pot lost water slowly and evenly, leaving a dark ring around its base. She sealed drainage holes with a mixture of clay and softened beeswax. She discarded vessels with hidden cracks. She learned that wide pots released water differently from tall, narrow ones. She covered the openings to keep sunlight, leaves, and insects out. There was no machine to admire and no expensive equipment to order. There was only clay, water, soil, and time. Clara understood something that the adults around her had never needed to consider. Water did not have to cross the surface of the field to reach a plant. It could wait underground until the roots came looking for it. Clara's first system did not work. That became clear within days. She had buried the vessels midway between the tomato plants because the spacing looked orderly. But young tomato roots had not yet spread far enough to reach the moist soil around the pots. The clay released water exactly as Clara hoped, only in the wrong place. Two vessels also contained hairline cracks that had escaped her tests. They emptied during the night, turning the soil around them into mud. Another pot had been sealed too well with wax and released almost no moisture at all. By the second week, one plant near a leaking vessel had begun to yellow. Several others drooped in the afternoon exactly as they had before the experiment began. A neighboring farmer named Calvin Mercer stopped his truck beside the fence and watched Clara lift a wet pot from the ground. "Seems like a long way to go when your father owns a hose," he called. Clara wiped mud from the vessel with her sleeve. The hose waters everything. That is generally the idea. I only want to water the roots. Calvin smiled and shook his head. He was not trying to embarrass her. To him, the solution was obvious. Dry plants needed water, and a hose delivered water faster than a buried pot ever could. Thomas was beginning to think the same thing. He had promised Clara the 6 rows, but the season was moving quickly. Every plant represented labor, seed, fertilizer, stakes, and market income. He could not allow an experiment to continue forever if the tomatoes began falling behind. "You have another week," he told her. "After that, we put the regular line through here." Clara nodded. She did not argue. She began measuring. Every morning before breakfast, she pushed a thin wooden stick into each vessel and marked the remaining water. She checked the soil at different distances from the clay walls. She recorded which pots emptied in a day, which lasted longer, and which seemed to change almost not at all. Her grandmother helped her make a simple chart on brown wrapping paper. There were no complicated formulas. Only the location of each pot, the condition of the plant beside it, and the number of mornings before the vessel needed refilling. The pattern appeared slowly. The pots that worked best were neither the largest nor the deepest. They were the ones placed close enough for young roots to find them but far enough away that the base of the plant did not remain constantly wet. The vessels also needed to sit slightly lower in the ground than Clara had first assumed. Covered openings reduced evaporation and prevented beetles, dirt, and small frogs from falling inside. Clara dug up nearly every pot and began again. Her brother Nathan saw her moving the same vessels she had buried only days earlier. "You are doing all that twice." "I did it wrong the first time." "You could pretend you meant to put them there." "The plants would know." Nathan had no answer to that. The second arrangement performed better, but not perfectly. Some pots still emptied too quickly because the soil around them was loose. Clara packed the earth more firmly. Others sat in pockets of heavy clay that kept the water too close to the surface. She adjusted those as well. Then, near the end of June, she uncovered one vessel to inspect it. Fine white roots surrounded the lower half of the pot. They had curved through the soil toward the steady moisture, gathering against the clay as though the plant had wrapped its fingers around a cup. Clara called her father. Thomas knelt beside the opening and studied the roots without speaking. He touched the soil several inches away. It was warm and dry. Then he touched the earth beside the pot. It was cool. "How often are you filling this one?" he asked. "Every third morning." Thomas looked toward the regular irrigation line running through the neighboring rows. It had been used every day that week. He stood slowly. "Keep your 6 rows," he said. Clara covered the roots again. The system had not succeeded because the pots forced water toward the plants. It succeeded because the plants learned where the water was. The rain stopped during the first week of July. At first, nobody in Macon County was particularly concerned. Summer dry spells were common, and the fields still held moisture from late spring storms. Farmers continued their normal schedules. Cattle stood beneath shade trees in the afternoon. Dust rose behind trucks, but only in thin clouds. Then the second week passed without rain. The grass along the roads lost its green color. The soil between crop rows hardened. Small creeks that usually carried water through the woods slowed to a weak movement beneath exposed roots and stones. By the third week, the heat settled over the county like a lid. The sky remained pale from morning until evening. Tomato leaves curled inward during the hottest hours to protect themselves. Blossom drop increased across the region. Fruit that should have grown large remained small, and cracks appeared in fields where the ground had been cultivated too deeply. Thomas Bell began running the well pump earlier in the morning and later in the evening. He avoided watering during the middle of the day, when wind and heat could steal much of the moisture before it entered the soil. Even so, the water level in the well fell. The first warning came from a neighbor whose shallow well began drawing cloudy water. Another family stopped watering their vegetable patch to preserve water for their cattle. At the farm supply store, conversations shifted from seed prices and machinery repairs to rainfall records and pump depths. People started looking at the sky even when there were no clouds. The bell tomato field needed more water each day. The plants in the conventional rows received a heavy soaking, recovered briefly, and wilted again by late afternoon. Much of the surface water ran into the furrows. Weeds flourished where the hoses had passed, consuming moisture meant for the crop. Clara's 6 rows looked different. The soil at the surface appeared dry. Anyone glancing from the road would have assumed the plants were being neglected. But the leaves remained open through most of the afternoon, and the stems held their weight. Beneath the surface, moisture spread in dark circles around the buried vessels. Clara filled them with 2 buckets each morning. She poured slowly, moving from one clay rim to the next. When a vessel accepted less water than usual, she knew the surrounding soil still contained enough moisture. When another emptied more quickly, she checked for a crack or for roots drawing heavily during fruit development. One evening Thomas carried a shovel to Clara's rows. He dug a narrow inspection hole beside a buried pot. Several inches beneath the dusty surface, the soil formed a cool dark ball in his hand. Then he crossed into a conventional row and dug at the same depth. The earth crumbled through his fingers. Margaret brought out the farm records, and the family began comparing water use. The measurements were not perfect, but the difference was impossible to ignore. Clara's rows were using less than half the water required by the surface irrigation nearby. By early August, county officials asked residents to reduce non-essential well use. The request was voluntary, but everyone understood what it meant. The underground water supply was falling faster than it could recover. Thomas had to choose which parts of the vegetable field would continue receiving regular irrigation. He walked the rows at sunset, touching leaves, checking fruit, and looking at plants that represented months of work. Several outer sections had already begun to fail. Keeping them alive would require water the family might soon need elsewhere. Clara followed him without speaking. When they reached her 6 rows, Thomas stopped. The plants were not untouched by the drought. Some lower leaves had yellowed, and the fruit was slightly smaller than in a wet year. But the vines were alive, upright, and still setting tomatoes. Thomas looked down at the clay rims almost hidden beneath the foliage. For weeks, people had laughed because Clara was burying pots. Now the wells were running low, and those pots were holding water where the heat could not reach it. By the final week of August, the drought had changed the color of Macon County. Pastures had faded from green to brown. Corn leaves rattled in the wind. Roadside ponds had retreated from the banks, leaving rings of cracked mud around the remaining water. On several farms, vegetable production ended weeks earlier than expected. The Bell family did not escape the damage. Some of Thomas's tomato rows produced only a fraction of their usual harvest. Plants near the upper slope lost blossoms before fruit could form. Several sections were abandoned so the remaining well water could be used where it still had a chance to matter. Clara's 6 rows continued producing. They did not become miraculous plants heavy with impossible amounts of fruit. The tomatoes were not the largest Thomas had ever grown, and some carried scars from the heat. But they were marketable. They ripened normally. Their vines remained strong enough to support new fruit while neighboring plants were already being pulled from soil. Calvin Mercer came first. He parked beside the fence one morning and walked into the field without making the joke he had prepared earlier in the season. He examined the dry surface between Clara's rows, then looked at the leaves. "How much water are you giving them?" Clara pointed to the 2 buckets near the end of the row. "For all of this." "For this morning." Calvin crouched beside one of the clay rims. "Show me." Clara removed the flat stone covering the opening. The water inside sat several inches below the top. She pushed a narrow stick into the vessel, checked the depth, and replaced the cover. Then she chose a pot near the end of the row and carefully removed the soil from one side. The roots were waiting there. They covered the vessel in a pale living network, pressing close to the rough clay wall. Some were as fine as thread. Others had thickened and branched, following the moisture around the curve of the pot. The soil touching them was dark even though no water had crossed the surface that morning. Calvin remained silent for a long time. "So the water comes through the pot." "Slowly." "And the roots come to it." Clara nodded. He touched the damp earth and then looked across the field toward the rows Thomas had stopped watering. "You have any pots left?" Clara had 7. She gave Calvin 4 and explained how to seal the drainage holes without coating the sides. She told him not to use glazed pottery and warned him to test every vessel for hidden cracks. She also explained that the pots needed covers, both to reduce evaporation and to keep insects from falling into the water. Within several days, 2 more neighbors came to see the system. One brought a notebook. Another brought 3 old clay vessels and asked Clara whether they would work. Nobody called them buried cups anymore. During the following winter, Thomas collected and glazed pots from an abandoned greenhouse outside town. He and Clara planned a larger system for the kitchen garden and a trial section of peppers. They adjusted the spacing so each vessel could serve more than one plant. Margaret added a column to the farm record specifically for underground irrigation. Clara never claimed that clay pots could solve every problem created by drought. Large commercial fields required different tools. Pots could crack, clog, or become difficult to remove once roots surrounded them. The system demanded patience and regular inspection. But on a small vegetable plot, it had done exactly what Clara hoped. It had not created more water. It had simply wasted less. The lesson remained visible even after the tomato vines were removed. When Thomas lifted the vessels from the ground at the end of the season, roots still clung to the rough clay surfaces. The plants had found the hidden moisture and built themselves around it. People often search for larger pumps, deeper wells, longer hoses, and more powerful machines when the ground becomes dry. Clara Bell had looked at an old flower pot and asked a smaller question. What if the water did not need to travel farther? What if it only needed to stay closer? Sometimes the most useful farming ideas do not arrive with noise, money, or machinery. Sometimes they are carried home behind a bicycle, buried between 2 rows of tomatoes, and understood only after the wells begin to fail.